Hi, Misha here, and it's time for another collection video, and this one is special for Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Festivus, Life Day. I don't think they had a holiday in Star Trek, which must be really lame. At least the weather here has been, well, Christmassy. Yeah, we actually did get some snow that stuck around for a while, and it's been pretty cold. And I thought for this collection video we would look at American guns. We've looked at Mausers, we've looked at Enfields, and specifically I thought we would look at kind of America's pursuit of a self-loading rifle, be it semi-automatic, automatic, or select fire. And America actually led the way in this field. It had some early aspirations. In fact, we'll kind of start with a couple of bolt actions that showed America's interest in such a gun. And then we'll get into the kind of the era of either too big or too little, with the Thompson there. And then, of course, we have to talk about the M1 Garand, the first self-loading gun adopted for mass issuance. And then followed very closely by the M1, or in this case on the couch here, the M2 Carbine, which was almost an assault rifle. So close. And then we get to the M14, which almost didn't suck. And then we enter into the part of the video that I call the AR-15 section, because from this point on it's pretty much AR-15s. But we'll talk about why America used the AR-15 and still uses it for going on 60 years now, along with its 5.56 223 cartridge, and kind of talk about why this is probably not going to change anytime soon. So yeah, we will kind of follow the progress from before self-loaders all the way through current modern day. This is kind of an extended episode as a Christmas gift. I know you won't watch it in one sitting, that's okay, but hopefully you might tune in to catch 15 minutes here and there over the holiday weekend. And we hope you're all doing well, healthy, and able to get some relaxing done. And just one more week to go in 2020. So what fun surprises will it have for us? But with that, let's take a trip down American memory lane to a time just before the Spanish-American War. Let's begin our story that will ultimately lead to self-loading rifles and modern-day assault rifles with this rifle here, the model 1895, so-called Lee Navy, manufactured by Winchester for both the Navy and Marine Corps. And yes, this is a bolt action, but there are two factors that really kind of show, even in the 1890s, where America would end up going, even if it would take it half a century. Now, we recently put out a video on the Craig Jorgensen, so that was America's first smokeless powder rifle, but it was pretty conventional, even by the standards of 1890, 1895. It used a .30 caliber projectile that was smokeless, but it was rimmed relatively low velocity, low pressure, and it used a simple rotating bolt. Its major advancement really was its magazine, capsule style. This was adopted by the Army, but the Navy wanted to go a different direction. They weren't really satisfied with the Krag, so in 1894, they held their own trials. And two designs kind of came out on top. One from Jorge Luger and another from James Paris Lee. Now, for these trials, the Navy supplied the ammunition, which was a 6mm, and even the barrels. So they already knew what they wanted. The interesting thing about this cartridge, it started off as 135 grain. It would be pared down later to 112. It was smokeless powder and very high velocity by the standards of the 1890s, so much so that it caused war problems of increased erosion, but a lot of that also had to do with the fact these had Metford-style rifling in the bore. So it was high velocity, very flat shooting, and 6mm was very small for the standards of the day and time. And even the barrel used 28 inches, which seems very long today, was a couple of inches shorter than the standards back then. Also, it used a semi-straight pull bolt. This was hoped to make reloading faster and easier, as did its integral kind of hybrid magazine that was a hybrid between Lee's design and say a Mannlicher. So the whole system was designed to be as rapid fire as possible, while still, of course, being a bolt action, and as high velocity, as long range, as accurate as possible, given the technology of the day. Even had a few modern features like a semi-pistol grip stock, although it still retained more of the curvy butt plate and other elements of its day and time, but still yet, it shows a very forward-thinking point of view for the Navy. And so they obviously selected Lee's design here and ordered it into production. Winchester would get a contract in 1896 for $10,000. It would be delivered in 1897. There would be some small batch orders here and there, about 1,000 of them, and then another contract for 5,000 would be issued in 1898. Meaning that about 16,000 were built for the Navy and Marines, who acquired about 3,000 of them. And a few were built, I knew I was going to do that, were built for the civilian market as well. Yeah, I have to hold it. That's why I had it on the other side. I know I had a good reason. These did see some use during the Spanish-American War, and were still technically in service for World War I, although they were being phased out. This rifle's major issue was that it was a little ahead of its time, or at least the cartridge was. The action had some pros and cons, and we've done a couple of in-depth videos on it, but this does kind of point the direction America would ultimately go. But it was also quite short-lived. Production was well over by around 1902, and they were declared surplus after World War I. With that, let's move on to another bolt action. It's not really that the Springfield M1903 itself is what I want to talk about and what really fits into this video, as it is the 1903 Mark I, and to be exact, the Pedersen device of World War I fame. our legend today. This is all we really have that survive, or some of these Mark 1s. Of course, the 1903 was a replacement for both the Craig and eventually the Lee Navy too. It was a Mauser system. It was a short rifle pattern with a 24-inch barrel. And alongside the 1917 U.S. Enfield was the standard infantry rifle in World War I, firing 30-06, 7.62 by 63, a Spitzer bullet. But in 1916-1917, a gentleman named John Pedersen had a clever notion. What if we could easily, effectively, and sneakily turn these into either machine guns or at least self-loading rifles? So he worked on the Pedersen device, which essentially you pulled the bolt out of your rifle. The idea was that an infantryman could make this whole process in like 15 seconds. And you would slide in the Pedersen device, and this cutout here was its ejection port. The Pedersen device was a simple blowback thing. It was semi-auto. It fed from a 40-round box magazine that was horizontal, and it fired a 30 caliber Pedersen cartridge, a little kind of pistol cartridge, really. In fact, this cartridge would be very similar to the later French 7.65 by 20 long used in their Melee 1935 pistols. So yeah, pull the bolt out, put that in, and you had a self-loading gun with 40 rounds, and they would typically issue 5 magazines with it. And the people at the military were suitably impressed, and they kept this pretty much a national secret. This kind of went hand in glove along with the Browning Model 1918 BAR, which was to be kind of an assault rifle, early version of. And these weapons were planned for the spring offensive in 1919 to surprise the Germans, so they tried to keep them under wraps. Now, Pedersen had worked for Remington, so they pretty much made the Pedersen devices. And full-scale production was ordered in 1918. But before any could actually make it over to Europe, much less in the war, armistice was signed, November 11. And so this was kind of surplus to needs. Therefore, in March of 1919, the Pedersen device and the whole program was essentially shut down. The contract was terminated. They had already built 65,000 of the devices, plus many magazines and many millions of rounds, and a modified version of the Springfield here was put into production between 1918 and 1919 that had this cutout in it. It also had a modified trigger, sear, and a few other components, but otherwise was standard, and they built nearly 102,000 of these before they terminated them. The Pedersen device was essentially put into storage in 1920, not looked at for a decade, and after it was clear that the M1 Garand, or Pedersen's own competing design, would be adopted, these were pulled out, declared surplus to needs in 1931, and were all but completely destroyed in 1932. Why did they destroy 65,000 devices that were brand new, essentially? Because they were worried they were going to come into the hands, come into the ownership, come into the use of hoodlums, scallywags, ne'er-do-wells, highwaymen. So even back then, in the 1930s, this could be considered one of the first gun control acts, perhaps. Fewer than 100 survived. Some were saved for research, testing, and just for museums. A few others walked away before they could be destroyed. But there are not many left in the world today. But it was the first effort for a mass production self-loading gun, But of course, that cartridge, 30 caliber Pedersen, was pretty wimpy. Yeah, you had 40 rounds, but it wasn't much more than a 32 caliber pistol round. So, but it was an early effort, and it had issues, but again, early effort, World War I, we can excuse them. And of course, they had other projects as well. Next up, we have the Thompson. Really here, it should be John Browning's Model 1918, which was designed for trench warfare to basically be an assault rifle. It was full auto, firing 30-06, and used detaching 20-round mags. But I don't have one of those. Ohio Ordnance has made some. I've had them in the shop. But the 1918 quickly devolved, I would argue, into the A2 LMG. An already heavy gun got heavier. And seeing this pattern, we have another, Mr. Thompson, who started working on what he initially called the trench broom. And this was to be lighter, handier, and easier to control with a higher magazine capacity, firing the standard 45 ACP round. He began work right before World War I, and he had prototypes ready to go in 1918, but again, the end of the war kind of put pay to that. Nevertheless, work continued. And by 1921, Colt was manufacturing the first version, the Model 1921. And as you know, the Thompson is select fire. The original version either fed from a 20-round stick mag, as seen here, or a 50-round drum magazine. Had a machined receiver, 12-inch barrel with cuts compensator. Originally, it had a vertical foregrip and rear grip and detaching stock. It had a Lyman-style adjustable rear sight. By today's standards, this was heavy and cumbersome, over 10 pounds, but compared to the BAR, it was nearly half the weight. And, with the 50-round drum mag, 2.5 times the capacity. Or, 20-round stick, much smaller, and they could issue 5 in a neat little pouch. While designed for the military at first, it achieved more success on the civilian market, and yes, the criminal market, and with police officers. The first military contract was for the Navy, which was for the Model 1928, and then the next contract was for the 1928A1, which this is here, with the horizontal grip, and a few other simplifications. It's worth pointing out that the original Thompson used the Blish system, so it wasn't a straight blowback. It did have a locking ability. But from there, we'd get into World War II. It would gain more and more traction as the submachine gun concept, as it's beginning to be known, is accepted in the 1930s. The FBI would adopt some. And then in 1938, this became standard military issue. Again, the Model 1928A1. And of course, for World War II, they would simplify it first with the M1, which would go to a straight blowback and whatnot. And then the M1A1 would be the final simplified version. And Thompson would have good success with these. The Auto Ordnance Company was set up to produce these, and they would build over 2.5 million. They would be in U.S. military service through the Vietnam era, and the FBI would not retire theirs until the 1970s. It was robust, well made, but yeah, heavy and complicated. But it was one of the very earliest submachine guns, with only the MP18 and perhaps the Italian Villa Perosa predating it, and it was one of the first to be truly commercially available. And all the first generation subguns were heavy, but this one still had an edge in that it did have a pistol grip. A lot of them did not. It had the detaching stock to make it more compact, high capacity drum or a lower capacity stick, vented barrel for cooling even though it's fixed, and a cuts compensator to check recoil. So this is America still pushing the semi-automatic or automatic select fire notion. Again, the 1918 BAR was kind of the other end of this, firing the full power. And here we have firing the rifle power. And this really would be America's standard submachine gun throughout most of World War II. The M3 grease gun really wouldn't come in to widespread use until the last year and a half of the war, at most. In fact, the last Thompson contract for the government was signed in February of 1944. And a lot of other nations used it, for example, Britain and Israel besides. But this is definitely, when you think early American automatics, one of the first. And we've done full videos on it, so if that interests you, check them out. And now we'll get to the grand self-loader of them all. There is so much to be said about the U.S. rifle M1, commonly referred to as the Garand. But just for the point of this video, after World War I, the U.S. military really did want a self-loading rifle, but they had a problem. The technology, the machines, the inventions of the day didn't really allow for what they wanted. If they made a rifle robust enough to fire thousands of rounds of 30-06, it would end up too heavy for the average soldier to carry indefinitely and be really too expensive to issue to everyone. Look at the 1918. On the other hand, if they made it light enough and affordable enough to mass produce, it wouldn't be durable enough. Look at the Thompson. Not that the Thompson's not durable, but if you tried to make a Thompson in 30-06 is my point. Around 1921, they did release specifications. They wanted a rifle around 9 pounds. It needed to be able to fire semi-automatic. They were hoping for 40 to 60 aim shots per minute. It needed to be easy to maintain for the soldier, and probably most importantly, especially as the 30s come to us, cost-effective to mass produce. And around this same time, the Springfield Armory employed a new gentleman by the name of John Garand, a Canadian, And he would just work there for a few years, but kind of get interested in the project. But really the first step was our old friend John Pedersen. He developed a self-loading rifle chambered for a new cartridge called .276 Pedersen, so in the 6.5mm range. And this was first created in 1924 and then tested in 1925, but was found wanting. So he kind of went back to refine it. Also, our old friend John Thompson worked on an upscaled rifle prototype. And by this point, John Garand had his very first prototype. And so they would kind of trade off between 1927 and 1929. And it would come down to around 1930, the Pedersen and the Garand designs. And these were both in .276. And ultimately, Garand's design would win out in 1931 and be headed for full adoption in 1932. But it's not the rifle you see here, the rifle you know today. It was rather different back in the early 30s. For one thing, to meet weight requirements and reliability requirements, Garand used a different gas system known as the Bang system developed in Denmark. And actually the early ones would have these for several years. And later, the German Gewehr 41W would use this system. It had pros and cons, but many more cons than pros. Another early problem. Now, Garand had originally made his rifle for 30-06 and then reworked it for the smaller, high-velocity .276, which it was adopted in. But then General Douglas MacArthur objected to this, citing they didn't need to be switching over to a new cartridge at this time, and that the military had millions of rounds in stockpiles of 30-06. So, once again, the Garand rifle was reworked for 30-06, which wasn't a huge deal because the Garand had started off that way. And the first kind of early test samples were sent in 1934 to troops for trials. They exhibited some issues. Finally, it was cleared for production at the end of 1935 and was officially adopted in 1936, with the first production rifles being handed over in 1937 and more problems. Between 37 and 39, there were a lot of updates, changes, recalls, changes, updates. It was not an immediate success, is my point, because it was one of the world's very first self-loading military rifles, and really the first to be intended for mass issuance. But in 1939, they solved a lot of their issues by going away from the Bang gas trap system and going to a long stroke piston system, and they used stainless steel in the gas system to help prevent corrosion, make it easier for the soldiers to maintain. And so by 1940, this was implemented, and also Springfield's production would be joined by Winchester, and they were really starting to make 100 or more per day before World War II, which allowed enough for the Army's immediate needs. And so these started to trickle into the other branches as well. Of course, after Pearl Harbor, the M1 Garand became a priority at both factories, and they would produce thousands a day during the height of the war. And those would be the two factories that made it. Now, of course, what we have here, you know the M1 Garand. We have a 2-lug rotating bolt. We have an op rod. Like I said, it's a long stroke gas piston. One of the most unusual features by our standards is the on-block magazine, the clip system. That's really more to do with the military. John Garand did have prototypes that took 20-round detaching mags, typically those for the 1918 BAR. So from the very beginning, it was felt this could have a detaching mag, but the Army at the time, for one thing, they wanted a flush-fitting mag. For another, they did want a mag that could be lost, and they did want to pay the expense of having additional mags. And before World War II, they were still concerned about soldiers wasting ammunition. Keep in mind that the Springfield 1903 had a feed cutoff. So, yeah. So it's a very advanced locking system and gas system for 1939, 1940. But the magazine system is unique, but also kind of retro in a way. Certainly not forward-thinking. And that's one thing that held this gun back a bit. On the other hand, it does have a semi-pistol grip stock. It is relatively lightweight. Ironically, it's a little bit lighter than the Thompson. 24-inch barrel, kind of borrowed the length from the Springfield. It is easy to maintain. And while it is not perfectly reliable, again, compared to its contemporaries, it was pretty well done. They would produce over 4 million during World War II. And while at the beginning of the war, they were a little bit in short supply, especially for the Marines, by the end, most of the military had one of these if they needed it. That said, the 1903 A3, a wartime version of the 03, was a supplemental bolt-action rifle. And production at Winchester and Springfield would end shortly after the war. Now, Winchester would eventually sell off their tooling to Italy. So when the Korean War began and they needed more of these, this was still very much the standard during Korea, Springfield just started up production again in 1950. But new factories had to be set up to help them, and it took time. These would end up being Harrington and Richardson and International Harvester, who would produce an additional 1.5 million M1 Garands, give or take, along with Springfield, between the beginning of the Korean War and 1956. Finally, Springfield would do one final run in 1957, kind of using up existing parts and assets, and then would switch over to the next rifle. Now, just because it was out of production does not mean it was out of service. Even 2 decades after, it was still a good rifle. It didn't really start to get replaced in the field until 1960. It was still considered standard issue until 63, and was considered a limited or substitute standard up through at least 1966. And some were not pulled out of service, auxiliary, whatnot, until 1970. And of course, these were given away to many, many American allies because we had a lot of them. In total, we had built over 6 million between World War II and Korean War production. And this is really where America came to the forefront of military technology for the individual soldier. However, it was still firing the old, by this point, 30-06 cartridge. Keep in mind that cartridge dates back to 1906, and it is very big, very heavy. It's 7.62 by 63. And we only have an 8-round fixed magazine with an interesting loading system. And again, the piston system was a great improvement over the gas trap, but it was not perfect. This asymmetric op rod left some room to be desired. We have a very long stroke gas piston, and it's not the cheapest gun in the world to produce. So, not bad though. 20 years service for a gun of this era. Let's move on to what came next. And what came next would not take long, but would have a pretty convoluted development cycle itself. The M1 Carbine and the M2 Carbine. So back in 1926, John Browning passed away, but his brother, Ed Browning, continued his legacy, or tried to. And he had what was known as the G30M, which was competition for the M1 Garand in the mid-late 30s, because like I said, the M1 Garand at that time was having problems. This would also be why the 1941 Jorgensen would come out. Winchester would buy this from him, and Ed would soon pass away like his brother. And in 1939, Winchester would hire David Williams of the carbine fame, an ex-con, to kind of work on Ed's design. And this resulted in the Winchester M2, which they were hoping to sell to the Marine Corps. At this time, 1939, 1940, the Marine Corps had not adopted the M1 Garand. That was an Army gun. So they were hoping to sell it to the Marines as their self-loading rifle. Well, they had to rework the bolt system, going to a 2-lug style like the Garand, because the original Browning pattern just really wasn't working out. And because they were busy with this, when the U.S. military announced they needed a light rifle, Winchester was not interested. Now, backtracking a bit to 1939, they wanted a light rifle because the M1 Garand wasn't well suited kind of for special forces as we think of them. Troops needing a PDW, something lighter, handier, and maybe cheaper. Something with more range and stopping power than a 1911A1, but not as bulky, cumbersome, or expensive as an M1 Garand or even a 1903. So in 1940, they outlined what they wanted, and they had some pretty strict requirements. For example, needing to be 5 pounds, select fire, so semi-auto or full auto. And they designed a new cartridge, which would ultimately become 30 caliber US carbine, which is 7.62 by 33. And they were going to have trials at the beginning of 1941, but this was pushed back to early summer, or late spring rather, because the cartridge wasn't ready yet till May. And again, at the beginning, Winchester was not interested, or just really didn't have the time. 9 other companies did submit designs. 2 of them were tossed out before anything because they didn't meet requirements. These included a design by John Garand, basically a scaled down version of his M1 for the 30 caliber, as well as a design from Colt and 5 others. In July, the Winchester company showed the M2 that they'd been working on, and while the military wasn't really keen on it, the M1 Garand had all of its bugs worked out by this point. They'd gone over to the piston system over the gas strap. They said, you know what, this would work great if you would scale it down for this new light rifle trial we're doing. So that's exactly what Winchester did. In just over 2 weeks, we had Frederick Humston and William Romer, who reworked the design and presented an extremely rough tool room prototype to the military in August. They were suitably impressed and said, this is great, put it in the trials. So they refined it a bit, put it in September of 1941, and already by October of 41, it was declared the winner. And so production was established at Winchester and at General Motors Inland Division to produce the new U.S. Carbine Model M1, or Model 1 M1. You know what I mean? And obviously after Pearl Harbor, this became a priority. Now, initially, as it was entering into service in 1942, one thing they dropped because it wasn't quite ready yet with the Winchester design was the requirement for full auto. But they left the ability to upgrade it to full auto in for future reference. So what do we have here? Well, they didn't quite meet the 5-pound requirement, but they got close. This is 5 pounds 3 ounces. It is short, under 36 inches, and it has an 18-inch barrel, which is definitely carbine length. No bayonet lug originally. Pretty simple rear sight. It does have an M1 Garand style bolt with rotating lugs. Now, one thing that David Williams contributed, and by the way, he continued to work on the design during the trials. He didn't just bail early on. He went to a short stroke gas piston versus a long. And of course, it fed from detaching 15-round double stack double feed mags. They were straight, made of pretty lightweight metal, but were very inexpensive and very easy to mass produce, so that's good. And yes, it did still use the 30 caliber carbine round that the military specified. And of course, during World War II, 8 other manufacturers would be set up for these, meaning this would be the single most mass-produced firearm of the war, with over 6.25 million made, just between late 1941 and mid-1945. It's quite remarkable. And while this wouldn't be standard issue for your rank-and-file infantrymen, it was obviously great for truck drivers, LST landing craft drivers, and kind of special forces like paratroopers. And of course they had the M1A1 folding stock version, which we recently featured in a video, so for more on that, check that out. But with that, what about the M2? So in 1944, once the war started to kind of go in favor of the Allies, there was time to revisit the M1 Carbine. Now, of course, there had been several production improvements and expediencies done already. For example, updating the extractor. But in 1944, in October, they adopted the M2 Carbine, which was just a M1 with a selector switch for semi-automatic single shot or full automatic fire. And this was starting to be fielded in early 1945 and was available for the invasion of Okinawa in April. They also, along with the new carbine, went to a 30-round magazine for it, so double the ammunition capacity. On top of that, instead of just, in addition to just producing factory M2s, they issued the T17 and the T18 conversion kits, which could basically change out 7 parts and make an M1 into an M2. That's because, again, from the beginning, they were going to make this a full auto, so converting M1s to M2s was pretty simple. There was also, of course, the M3, which had an early night vision optic, and this was also used at the tail end of World War II. Production would end a short time after the war was over, as contracts were fulfilled. But the U.S. had a bunch of these. Now, during the war, they had given many as lend-lease to allies like Britain. They had also dropped many behind enemy lines to help partisans. But they still had millions left over. So when Korea kicked off, the M1 and especially the M2 were there. Now, much can be said about the M1, M2. On the positive, it was light, handy, reliable enough. You could carry a lot of ammunition for it. Magazines were readily available. Easy to use, easy to train. Had more range and was easier to shoot than, say, the 1911 A1. It was also lighter than the Thompson or Garand. On the other hand, it wasn't perfectly reliable. It was never meant to be. And the magazines were pretty thin and at least semi-disposable. But really the biggest thing was the cartridge. 30 caliber carbine, 7.62 by 33. It was a non-corrosive primer, very modern for that time. It was a rimless or recessed-rimmed cartridge. That's good. And it was nearly a straight wall cartridge. It did have a slight taper, but it wasn't a bottleneck cartridge. It also was a round-nosed bullet, not a spitzer, not a pointed. So this did mean that its effective range, power, penetration, stopping power was limited. Now, you don't hear as much from World War II about this as you do Korea. And there's a whole debate on that I don't feel like getting into. But regardless, it had a lot going for it, and it was a very forward-thinking gun. But I think its cartridge was holding it back. Nevertheless, it was very much in military service, even in the USA during the Vietnam War. Although by this time it's mostly carried by guards or many in the Air Force. But it wasn't officially declared obsolete until 1970. And many U.S. allies continued to carry the M1, M2 for even much longer. And many survive in the world to this very day. Often overlooked because of its big brother, the M1 Garand, the M1 Carbine kind of set the stage. And many, myself included, think it was nearly the first assault rifle, especially the M2. but its cartridge just was not quite there, and it maybe lacked one or two other refinements. And now we come to the M14 and its interesting place in this story. And of course that relates to the FAL. This is my Israeli, which is relatively early example, so it'll do as a good stand-in. Actually, prior to World War II, Mr. Seve of the Belgian company Fabrique Nationale Herstal was working on a self-loading rifle, but this is interrupted by the Nazis. But after liberation, he went back to work in 1946, and by 47, he had the earliest versions of this gun here. Now, these were actually chambered for 8mm Kerrs, 7.92 by 33, the MP44's round. The next year, the British would trial his gun out and suggest their new .280 cartridge, which is again in the 6.5mm range. And the FN complied and reworked their gun for that. So the early prototypes from the late 40s of the FAL are chambered for the British round. Well, America gets involved in the action around 1950, 51, 52. Now, people like to throw a lot of shade for what America did, but to be fair, in this period, Britain itself went with its own M2 bullpup. And FN was far from done with the FAL. So America said, why don't you chamber it for our new 30 caliber light rifle cartridge, which was essentially kind of based on 300 Savage. It was a shortened 30-06. And this, of course, became 308, which eventually evolved into 7.62 NATO, 7.62 by 51mm. But at this time, it's known as the T65 cartridge. And there's a lot of back and forth, but it's intimated that America will seriously consider the FAL if the rest of NATO kind of goes with their cartridge. And at this time, NATO is really trying to standardize on as much as they can in case of another war in Europe. Well, 1953 rolls around, Britain again changes its position, ends up ordering the FAL, which becomes the L1A1. Of course, Canada is first to get it as the C1 in 1954, and Israel would follow a short time later in 1955, adopting their version known as the Romat. America, meanwhile, is getting ready to replace the M1 Garand. And a couple of contenders are based on original Garand designs. You have the T20. It was updated in the 1950s to the T44, and the T20 was basically a magazine-fed Garand that took BAR mags, I believe. There was also the T25, which is more of an offshoot. It evolved into the T47. And true to their word, the Americans put the FAL on the trials as the T48. This was a customized version, and if it would have been adopted, production would have fallen to Harrington and Richardson, with High Standard as a secondary contractor. And they produced multiple trials guns, especially Harrington and Richardson. And between 56 and 57, they put the two guns together through their paces. Both passed the trials. So why did they adopt the T44, which became the M14? They claimed that it had a little bit better performance in the cold weather, and Springfield Armory assured them that they could use many of the same parts and pretty much all of the same tooling they had for the M1 Garand to make the M14. And of course, this was a domestic design versus this that is obviously not. So in the end, while NATO did go with 7.62 NATO 30 caliber light rifle, cartridge, America went with the M14 and was really one of the very few countries to do so. At this time, the FAL was very successful. Speaking of cost, it should be pointed out that out of appreciation for helping save them in World War II, FN Belgium offered free licensing, free production to the Allies for the FAL, so it would have also been a very economical choice. And it was already developed, already ready to go by 1956. Whereas the M14, not so much. Nevertheless, that's what they went with. Weight-wise, the two guns are roughly the same, frankly. The M14, because of its muzzle brake, is about 46 inches long, has a 22-inch barrel. The original FAL is about 43 inches long, and it has a 21-inch barrel. Both feed from detaching 20-round mags. Of course, the FAL has a pistol grip, the M14 does not. Both have last round hold opens. The FAL has a manual release. The M14 does not. The charging handle is non-reciprocating on the FAL. On the M14, it reciprocates. And the T48, much like the Canadian C1, could be topped off by chargers, stripper clips. As far as the gas system, the FAL uses a tilting wedge bolt with a short stroke piston that is very adjustable. The M14 uses a 2-lug rotating bolt, and it uses a different gas system. It's actually more in common with the tappet short stroke of the M1 Carbine in a lot of ways, but it is, of course, inspired by the M1 Garand, and it has the big long op rod, which the FAL doesn't. And of course, both could mount a flash hider, bayonet, that kind of thing. Well, they made the decision that they made. In 1957, they declared the T-44 the winner. It was adopted as the U.S. Rifle Model 14, and an initial order was placed, with production beginning in 1959. Why did it take them 2 years when they already have all the tooling? Well, as it turns out, Springfield was maybe a little too optimistic. Turns out they can only use 25% of the parts, mostly things to do with like the sights. And a lot of the tooling either really wouldn't work for the new gun, or was just so worn out that it needed replacing anyway. Of course, this ended up costing a lot of money, frankly. So already that promise was kind of broken. But with that said, production began at Springfield, also at Winchester and TRW. And the first rifles were delivered to the military in 1960 and really made it into the field in 1961. In between that year and 1963, it started to replace M1 Garand and other guns. So what exactly did they end up with, and how did it do? Throughout its history, the U.S. Army has tried to do the one-size-fits-all thing, and sometimes it works. When they went to the kind of universal short rifle with the Springfield 1903, that was a good idea. With the M14, not so much. Not only was it to replace the M1 Garand, as you would suspect, it was also to replace the M1 Carbine and the 1918 A2 BAR LMG and submachine guns like the 1928 Thompson, the M1 Thompson, and the M3A1 grease gun. For the M1 Garand, it did okay, because it was basically a select fire Garand. that was magazine fed. And it was actually a little bit longer, but in some ways a little slimmer. Anyway. And the 7.62 NATO cartridge had the same performance as the 30-06, but it was about half an inch shorter and roughly 10% lighter. As far as replacing the M1 Carbine, it did give more range and stopping power than the Carbine, but definitely at the cost of size and weight. So only partially successful there, let's say. Well, what about replacing submachine guns? Well, ironically, it doesn't really weigh much more than the Thompson, but it is heavier than the grease gun and more expensive to produce. And it is longer than both, for sure. And in full auto, it was uncontrollable, except for highly trained soldiers. Even if not, it only had 20-round box mags. To that end, actually, most of the standard M14 rifles had their selector switches replaced with the lockout here that just limited to semi-auto. But to be fair, other 7.62 NATO guns like the FAL were often used in semi-only, and some of them were only semi-only, like for example the British L1A1. So that's not a huge dig against it. But this is no submachine gun replacement. It's not small enough, light enough, and it doesn't have the fire rate for up close and personal. Well, what about replacing the LMG? Well, originally there was going to be an alternative version known as the M15 for this that had a heavier barrel, a bipod, and some other features. But in their infinite wisdom around 1959, they canceled the M15. It was adopted, but it was never really produced or fielded at all. They just said, well, we can just make the M14 a light machine gun. We'll just throw a bipod on it, and we'll retain one feature from the M15, this flip-up butt plate. Instead of only putting this on the M15, we'll just make this a standard feature for the M14. And as you might guess, as a light machine gun, it was piss poor. It's too light. 20-round mag only. Like I said, full auto, it's not very good. It doesn't have a pistol grip for control. It was a very ineffective machine gun. So the one-size-fits-all did not work out well. Although, historically, in the long term, it might have proven okay. Nevertheless, this was the standard service rifle when America went into Vietnam, beginning in 1964. And so, especially early on, it would see quite a bit of use, as was made rather famous by Full Metal Jacket. The M14 might have been a pretty good rifle for World War II, or even Korea. But for Vietnam, it was not. Vietnam was a relatively close-range war. War short, light, and handy. And honestly, spray and pray were more important. The only good thing really this rifle had going for it in that war, its heavy cartridge would punch through cover very well. But its target-style adjustable sights, not really that useful. And its wooden stock, because of how it disassembles, could actually swell in the humidity, making disassembly difficult and reassembly nigh on impossible sometimes. Now they would replace the wood stock with a fiberglass lower to match the fiberglass upper handguard, so that did help the matter. But in 1961, this model went into development. This was actually designed by a U.S. Army captain. This is the M14 E2, later M14A1. And what he basically did between 61 and 63 was design a new stock for the M14. It has a straight comb, pistol grip, rubber recoil pad with flip-up butt plate still. It would have the selector switch in place for semi or full auto. He would use the ventilated synthetic handguard, or used early on for heat dissipation on the barrel. He would have a fold down foregrip with redesigned sling. He would have an adjustable bipod. And finally, the flat shotter is still here because it wasn't threaded on in a traditional sense, but it was overlaid with a stabilizing brace that clamped onto the bayonet lug. And all of these changes turned the M14 into a half-decent light machine gun, a role that previously it really sucked at. Now, it's still a relatively light barrel gun. It still does not have a quick change barrel. It's still limited to 20-round magazines. But in Vietnam, this was a decent suppressive fire gun. Having a pistol grip and a straight comb stock really gave more control. The easy-to-use foregrip helped even more there. What's fun about this foregrip, the way it's designed, you can actually adjust it. It can be positioned in a few different locations under the stock because of the little holes. The bipod 2 was adjustable. And all of these were just conversions. Originally, about 8,300 were ordered converted in 1964-65 by Springfield. They would use existing guns. They weren't new builds. And then in 1966, this was standardized as the M14 A1. And a few more were converted. It's said that roughly 10,000 to 10,500 E2/A1s were made. Again, you're just taking a normal gun, dropping it into a new stock, and giving it more hardware. It was obviously much heavier. The stock itself is heavier, and the bipod adds a good chunk of weight. But this wasn't a bad thing in the machine gun role. And so these were actually pretty successful and popular in Vietnam during the mid-late 60s. And so it did find a role there. But as for the standard rifle, not so much. In fact, this, of course, was adopted during the Eisenhower administration. When the Kennedy administration came in 61, Robert McNamara was not a fan of this rifle. So as soon as he could, he ended further orders, further contracts, halfway through 1963. And the last ones would be delivered, built by TRW as it happens, in 1965. Thus ending the M14's production cycle. And actually very soon, its service would be over as well. And while they built 1 million of these, give or take, it's nowhere near its parent rifle, and it had the second shortest time as the standard general service rifle, with only the Craig beating it out. And it was given to a few allies. Even Taiwan made some as the Type 57. It just never reached anything like the popularity of the FAL or HK's later G3, because it was a dinosaur. It was America's last battle rifle, but it was too conservative. And of course, you know what is coming next. And maybe because of how conservative this was, it allowed the next rifle to be the huge leap forward they would prove to be. This may not be the rifle you expected next, but it's where we really need to start. And this isn't exactly right. This is a later production Portuguese Armalite Ar10 but it'll do. Now, many say that the AR10 was competition and lost out to the T44 or the T48. This isn't true. These trials were planned in 1955 and started in 1956. Armalite only began as a division of Fairchild around 1954. Originally, we had George Sullivan, and he quickly met, befriended, and hired somewhat young man at the time, Eugene Stoner. And the company had some early success with survival guns. You might know the AR-7, the takedown rifle. But then they started working on a 7.62, at the time, the very new Cartridge, battle rifle. And the first prototypes were ready in 1956. But these were hand-built, essentially tool room models done over in Costa Mesa, California. They never had a full production factory. The Armalite was always an idea company. And this was a radical new gun. I mean, you can just tell looking at the two. And they benefited from a lot of the technology and materials that Fairchild was using, being an aircraft manufacturer. For example, aircraft grade aluminum receivers, modern synthetic polymer furniture. And of course, many will point to the fact that they even tried doing a sleeved barrel that had a steel liner with the alloy outer shell. They tried this. This was a George Sullivan idea. It's one that from the get-go Stoner objected to, and as it turns out, he was absolutely right. But the idea was to be as light and modern as possible, and they succeeded. This was, at its lightest, just over 7 pounds, and at its heaviest, about 8.5 pounds. So noticeably lighter than the FAL, the M14, and others. It had a nearly 21-inch barrel and was about 41 inches overall. It had an inline stock with sights. Of course, we have the trigger, charging handle, port door. Stoner's main contributions were the multi-lug rotating bolt that he, let's say, was inspired by Melvin Johnson, the M1941. And he combined that with what is often referred to as a direct gas system. It's more of an internal piston. You can argue it's not a true direct gas. That would be something like on the French MAS-49. This is a combination, a hybrid system. But its benefits, it's lightweight, very few moving parts, at least fewer than others, easy for a soldier to maintain, and basically self-regulating. And this rifle was designed to be cheap and easy to manufacture by the standards of the late 50s, using investment casting and forging and other modern techniques, eventually even chrome lining. The U.S. did look at it in 1957, but the trials were basically over. And in 1957, it was still very much a developing design, so they passed on it. They would actually revisit it again in November of 1960 at Aberdeen, and they would note great success, much improvement from earlier, and have much more positive things to say about these versions. Armalite tried marketing this. There's a whole history, and we've done videos on it. I'm not going to go into it now, but they had only limited success, mostly because of politics and also the fact that they were doing a very, very new gun. There were some sold to the Dutch, Portuguese, like this one, probably bought the most. Portuguese paratroopers use these. And there's the Sudanese version, there's the Cuban version. But anyway, production was basically over by the early 60s. And they were never built in any numbers in California. Instead, they were contracted out. And fewer than 10,000 were built. And that's pretty much it. Now, of course, in more modern times, Eagle Arms purchased the Armalite name, reintroduced the AR-10, and it's a good gun, but it's basically an upscaled AR-15. This is more of its own thing. Internally, it's pretty different, although it still uses the same principles. And it very much laid the groundwork for its little brother. Alright, at this point, I'm going to do my best to make this not turn into the AR-15 show. But it's kind of the point in time we are at. Now, the AR-10, like I said, really wasn't ready during the trials that selected the M14. There was an early prototype that kind of squeaked in, kind of like that person coming into a party at 12 o'clock at night when everyone else is about ready to go home. And it was very quickly turned away. He just wasn't ready. But in 1957, Armalite with Eugene Stoner at the head scaled the AR-10 down to fire what was at the time a brand new cartridge, 223 Remington, based on 222. Ever since World War II, studies were conducted that showed that combat was at ever increasing range, down to 300 meters, then 150 meters, even less. And the single, carefully aimed shots really were not more effective than what was essentially spray and pray. And it was clear that a new cartridge, a smaller diameter, higher velocity cartridge, would suit the battlefield of the Cold War era. Keep in mind, America had had a 6mm cartridge way back with the Lee Navy, the gun we started this video off with. But at that time, it was too ambitious. It had too high pressures. It eroded the bores too quickly. Metallurgy just wasn't there. And America had a chance to go to the .276 Pedersen, and then later the British .280, but stuck to .30 caliber, and thus the M14. Now, the thing to remember, too, all the guns we've seen for America up to this point were developed at government arsenals, Springfield. Now, everyone knows the AR-15 is a Colt. Well, even though they were working on the AR-10 and had a few limited sales, and had just made what would become the AR-15 at Armalite, firing the new cartridge, their owners at Fairchild were not happy with the Armalite company's success. In other words, they weren't generating money. Therefore, in 1959, the design for the AR-15 was sold to Colt. And by the way, in 1961, Eugene Stoner would follow his design from Armalite to Colt. But Sullivan would remain at Armalite. So from there, Colt very quickly proved the problem with the AR-15 wasn't the gun, but it was Armalite's marketing or lack thereof. They very quickly had a contract with Malaysia. Then the U.S. became interested in 1960, especially the Air Force. They would order some, this would be rescinded, but the Kennedys did like them. This would lead to Project Agile with the early versions, which Colt renamed the Colt 601. They made some improvements and refinements to the design, including making a flash header standard, things like that. And then they would go to the 602, which took the twist rate from 1 in 14 down to 1 in 12 for better stabilization in the cold. And then there's a lot I could go into here between 1960 and 63, but we don't want to be here literally all night, right? Needless to say that in 1963, future M14s were canceled. What was to replace them? This gun here. The Air Force was an early proponent of it and had some of the earliest Colts. But finally the Army was talked into giving it a go, and the Marines would soon follow. Therefore, in 1964, Colt would release the Model 603, which was the same as the originals, except it had a forward assist, a feature that both Colt and Stoner said was unnecessary, but the bureaucrats thought they knew best. The Air Force would continue to buy slab sides like this, known as the 604. Otherwise, they were the same, they just had a different upper. And this would become standardized in the Air Force as the M16. In the Army and Marines, it would take a little longer time, and it was known as the M16a1. And so it made it over to Vietnam in late 64 and was at first only special forces, but soon was being issued in ever large numbers. Now again, I don't want to get into it, but early on they had some problems with jamming, as you know, and a lot of it had to do with the switch from stick powder to ball. This was done by the government to both save money and give a little more range to the cartridge, because they were very nervous about finally getting away from their comfort zone, known as .30 caliber. And they did not issue these with cleaning kits because they advertised them, the government did, not Colt, as self-cleaning. Obviously, this was soon rectified by issuing cleaning kits and then chrome plating the chambers. And so the M16 was well on its way to being perfected. And this is why, already by 1966, the M14, with the exception of the A1, was increasingly marginalized. What's really remarkable about the M16 is how it came to be. It was from a private company designed by Armalite, marketed and made by Colt. And it wasn't really made to meet a military requirement. Not exactly. There were some outlines given in the 50s for a specific thing, but this was really private industry innovating. And I think thanks to the fact that the M14 was so unsuccessful, it allowed this to come in. And keep in mind that in 1964, when it first started to be sent to Vietnam, Colt had only purchased the design 4 years before. And the design itself was less than 10 years old, period. And it wasn't just like it was an update of a previous thing. The whole concept of alloy receivers, polymer furniture, even the 223 cartridge was brand new. So the fact that it worked at all is quite remarkable. But of course there was room for improvement. The original 601, 602, represented by my SP1 here, had a 20-inch light profile barrel, open birdcage flash hider, rifle length gas system, slab side upper and lower, had a non-retained front pin, buttstock with a rubber butt plate, fed from a 20-round magazine. You know the drill. Very light, very handy. Originally had a chrome-lined bolt carrier and all that too. But between 65 and 67, several upgrades and improvements in manufacturing steps were taken, which resulted in early 67 in the standardization, moving away from the XM16 and XM16E1 to the M16A1. Now here we see our forward assist that was made For the Army, we went to a trapdoor buttstock for that cleaning kit. They updated the polymer used in the furniture to make it more durable. We went to a fence around the mag catch. We also have this fence up here, which is because we now have a retained front pivot pin. No guesses as to why they did that. They also improved the 20-round mag by giving it a more durable finish. The earliest mags were actually the same waffle pattern as on the AR10. The front sight base went through several evolutions. And the flash hider went from the early 3-prong to the late 3-prong to now this enclosed A1 birdcage. The gas tube also got a new bend, and many other changes. For example, internally the bolt group went to being all phosphated. Originally they started with chrome plated chambers, and that was the standard through most of Vietnam. In fact, a fully chromed bore would not be introduced until 1970. About the same time this trapdoor buttstock was, actually. But before the end of Vietnam, it was a fully evolved, mature system for an infantry rifle. Of course, it was select fire, single shot, or full auto. They could issue a lot of mags. 20 rounds were the standard. 30s would come into use beginning in 1968, but 20s were very much the standard through the rest of Vietnam. And once soldiers got comfortable with it, there were certainly no more complaints about the M16 than there had been with the M14, and some people liked it even more. Of course, it wasn't perfect, but what in this world is? But there was one question. This actually did a pretty good job of replacing the M14 rifle. Also, it was a good replacement for a submachine gun because it was relatively light, had good firepower, it was controllable and automatic. But what about replacing the light machine gun? Well, the military had an answer for that. I'm not saying it was a good one, but they had one. Take a look. Behold, their solution. If this looks like a standard A1 with a bipod, that's because that was exactly what they suggested. Hey, regular infantrymen, keep your selector on single. And for the person assigned to be a squad automatic weapons guy, we'll give you some extra mags and a bipod. And you keep your selector, for the most part, on automatic. Not the worst thing ever, I suppose. But you can see why the M14 A1 did gain some traction even after the M14 was out of service. By the way, I did grab a Korean bipod because it was the first one at the top of the bin. But same thing. And funnily enough, they used this early on because this was put into service without a whole lot of forethought. They used just this kind of a general utility M56 pouch, which could hold 4 20-round mags well, but it was too deep. So typically they would put socks or something else in the bottom so they could actually grab their mags. Of course, later they would make a specific mag pouch for the M16. But early on, a lot of the gear used for other guns was kind of fitted for it, including the sling and whatnot. So yeah, this was their answer for a saw weapon. Not ideal with the light barrel and 20-round mag, I admit. But at any rate, by 1968, it was pretty tried and tested. It was in standard issue. This allowed the M14 to be retired. Most M14s are pulled out of Vietnam between 66 and 68. And after this was complete, they were pulled out of the European theater between 1969 and 1970, and were effectively out of service and put back into stores many of them virtually brand new. Now, some were taken out to be turned into M21s and later M25s, but that's a story for another day. My point is, by 1970, the M16 was the unexpected king, although it did have one noteworthy challenger around this time. It would be completely a disservice to talk about evolution of the self-loading rifle in America and not talk about this one. Even after they sold the AR-15 to Colt, Armalite continued. In fact, Stoner, while he was still there in 1960, was working on a new design, the AR-16. And when he left, Sullivan and others took it over, scaling it down from 7.62 to 223, and coming up with the AR-18. And by 1964, a few early prototypes were ready to go. And the Army actually got their hands on some and did evaluate them. But by this point, the AR-15 had had a little time to mature, had Colt backing it, was already adopted by the Air Force, and was about to be in Army and Marine service. And the AR-18, while it showed promise according to the Army, they noted many shortcomings. So between 65 and 68, Armalite and Customeza continued to advance the design, and the Army would try it out again and agree that it was coming along nicely and had some benefits over the AR-15. But by this point, the M16a1 was in service. So much like how the AR-10 was a little too late, the AR-18 was as well. But again, it did have many things to recommend it. For example, because of its system, it could have a true folding stock. It had an ambidextrous safety. It had a scope mount as standard, built in. It fed from very similar 20-round mags. They're not interchangeable, but they are similar. 18-inch light profile, 1-in-12 twist barrel, 3-prong hider. It used basically the same rotating bolt with a square carrier. And of course, its big advancement was a short stroke gas piston, and the bolt carrier would actually ride on 2 rails. This would allow for loose tolerances and also prevent carrier tilt. But the main thing here was economy. The AR-15 was easy for an industrialized nation to produce, but the AR-18 was designed for almost anyone to produce. To that end, it was made with a lot of stamped and welded steel, the receivers included. It also used cast components wherever possible. And was just, generally lighter and handier, thanks to the folding stock. It did not have a chrome line bore. Again, this is an economy. But its operating system was potentially very reliable and adaptable. And it was just, something else, a new design to compete with the AR-15. And it sort of did. Flipping it over, you can see it has a spring-loaded ejection port like the AR-15, different style, but the same principle. It has a kind of crank-style charging handle that you can reach over with. It does reciprocate. The mag release is on this side here. Here's our alternative safety. Pretty ergonomic pistol grip. Yeah. Even though America wasn't interested, Armalite did offer this to other customers, including the British SAS, who liked it, but it ultimately did not adopt it. They would build a little over 4,000 in Customeza. Then they would have a deal with Howa of Japan to build these, but this would fall apart, mostly because of the Vietnam War. The next, they would sign a contract in 1974-75 with Sterling in the United Kingdom, and they would produce these from about 1979 to 1985 or 1988, depending on who you go with. Howa would only build about 3,900, and the majority of these were built by Sterling, about 12,500. In total, between 20,000 and 20,500 AR-18s, or really the semi-automatic version here, AR-180s were built. So more than the AR-10 at least. And there really weren't many, if any, military users. Some police departments did buy these. This was kind of the competition for the Kalashnikov, especially the AKM, hence all the stampings. But as you know, where this really came into play, came into influence, this system, especially the gas system, inspired everyone in the 1980s and 1990s. From HK with the G36, and yes, the HK 416. Enfield with the L85, although I don't know if I would credit it. I promise the problems of the L85 have nothing to do with the AR-18, I promise. And a lot of inspirations elsewhere, including in Italy, in the Far East, and of course, not surprisingly, also in Japan with their Type 89. So the concept was very solid, but the execution was kind of half-baked, much like with the AR-15 when Colt took it over in 1959. If Colt had taken over the AR-18 or someone else similar to them, it probably could have really been evolved into something. But as it is, it was just too weak to really meet the militaries, and it came out at the wrong time. If it had come out earlier or later, it would have probably had good success. But in the mid-60s, the clients for this were just not there. Many were still using the FAL. Many were not ready to switch over to 223 until the late 70s. And the US was already satisfied with the M16 and soon to be M16a1. But you gotta give credit because it's a very American design. And it was really the last gasp of Armalite as it was at the time under Sullivan. The company would soldier on a little bit longer, but soon would be out of business, and the name would be retired throughout the 80s until again Eagle Arms bought it in the 90s. Really neat guns, the AR-18s. Very interesting. Well, let's get back to the AR-15 show. And with the M16A2, I think we're getting into territory many of you are well versed in. But, hey, gotta cover it, right? This dates back to the late 70s when NATO met to try to select more standards. They ultimately went with the Belgian version of 223 that was adapted a bit to become M855, which was a 62 grain bullet. And whereas the original 193 bullet 55 grain did a 1 in 12 twist well, the newer heavier bullet was found best with a 1 in 7. Therefore, a new weapon was called for. Colt would suspend 603, 604 production around 1982, at least for the military. And since they're already having to go to a gun with a new twist rate, they took this opportunity to address some things and make some improvements. For one, they went to a heavier profile barrel, still 20 inches, but heavier profile from here forward. They also went to a new pattern of muzzle device that's solid on the bottom, so it kind of acts as a recoil check a bit, but still can be a flash hider. Still takes the same bayonet. One area they really made an improvement, small but important, were the handguards. These had to have, the A1s had to have right and left, and they were relatively fragile. They gave good ventilation, but they were fragile. They went to this new pattern, the top and bottom, and more secure, plus they had a better heat shield inside. Also quite important, they went from the straight slip ring to the Delta style, which is so much easier to use. They reinforced the lower receiver from the back here and the front here. The port door was changed. They added a brass deflector to make it more lefty friendly. They went to a round forward assist over the teardrop. They added a tick mark to the selector so you could see which position it was on from even the right side. Even though the 30 round mag had been in use for a long time, it became a standard with the A2. They also updated the pistol grip. They added this finger. They also got rid of the useless hole for a sling swivel that was never used. And they updated the butt stock, making it 5/8 of an inch longer. Still has a storage compartment. And then finally, mostly at the behest of the Marines, they went from the more or less fixed rear sight here that could be adjusted for windage with the tool to a fully windage and elevation adjustable rear sight by hand. More adjustable, but also a little more expensive and a little more fragile. And of course the cost for all these improvements was weight. The A2 is noticeably heavier than the A1, which some have criticized. I'm not saying they're wrong, but it's also a good rifle. Well, this pattern was made pretty early on, but it wasn't put into production until 85 and put into service until 86, because as with many NATO members, there were some budget constraints and whatnot. And it actually took them about 5 years to kind of change out many in the military. In fact, by the Gulf War, some were still sporting the old A1s. But soon after, most of your military, active military at least, had the new A2, mostly because it needed to have the 1-in-7 twist. And that meant most of the A1s were given to the National Guard or police departments. And of course, Colt would continue producing those. Now, there were actually two versions. There was the Colt Model 701, which had the safe full auto trigger, and there was the 705, which had the safe 3-round burst fire control group. It was actually the 705, the 3-round burst, that was the A2. The 701, which is purchased in small numbers and saw more use with the Navy, was known as the M16a3. And again, this 3-round burst would receive some criticism too. Of course, it had its proponents. And that's your, your A2. Some are still in service today, but most were retired out a long time ago. And this was really the last of the major M16 rifle variants. But the AR-15 show is far from over. Let's go back in time a bit. Now we come to the AR-15 carbines, or the CAR-15s. It's interesting, after adopting a universal short rifle in 1903, America really didn't do much with carbines unless you consider the M1 Garand versus M1 Carbine, but those are two different systems. For a long time, they just kind of had a one-size-fits-all gun. And compared to the M14, the M16 was short and light. But from the beginning, Colt had plans to make this entire family. They wanted to take advantage of just how modular the AR-15 was, especially by the standards of the 1960s. So just as the M16e1 was coming about in 1964, they tried the first carbine, known as the Colt Model 605. They took an M16 and cut its 20-inch barrel down to 15 inches right here in front of the gas block, and it had the standard flash hider. So it was about 5 inches shorter and a little bit lighter. It also had a basically zero dwell time and incredible flash. They did not make many of these, and only a tiny handful made it into the hands of the military for testing. Next was the Model 607, and this is when we start to see the modern carbine. The 607 introduced the short 7-inch gas system, a 2-position collapsing stock, and a 10-inch true carbine barrel. But it had unique furniture. Essentially, they took a standard A1 stock, cut it in half, and made it into a collapsing stock. And they took standard A1 handguards and cut them down in half to make for that. And they would make, a couple of hundred of these, and some of them would end up in the hands of Navy SEALs, even coming up in a few pictures, known as the GX 5857. Originally, this too had just a 3-prong flash hider, and again, the dwell time was not great, so reliability was not great, and flash and noise were great. And this would give way to the Model 609, known as the XM177E1, which was essentially the previous model, but given with updated furniture. They went to a new pattern of round handguard, much like later used on the A2. And they went to a new pattern of collapsing buttstock. Still 2-position, but now it's actually the kind of classic Car 15 style, made of metal, as it happens. Originally, the 10-inch barrel of the 609 just had a flash hider. Then they would develop a 3.5-inch solid body moderator. This was to try to help fix some of the issues with the short barrel. There would also be the Model 610. The only difference between the 09 and the 10, the 09 had a forward assist, the 10 did not, and the 10 was purchased by the Air Force as the GAL 5 and later 5A. Next, we would get this model here, the Colt Model 629. And the major difference is they extended the barrel from 10 inches to 11.5. And this helped a great deal. This gave more dwell time, which improved reliability. It also improved accuracy a bit, because we're actually able to get nearly a full 1 in 12 twist out of it. It also decreased sound and flash, and it had a new moderator. Now this is the 4.3-inch moderator. It was originally trialed on late 609s, 610s, but was standard with the 629. And because of the extra length, it could also mount the M48 grenade launcher, underbarrel grenade launcher. They did remove the bayonet lug on these. It was otherwise quite standard. Also, by this point, the 30-round mag is starting to appear, and was often first used on these because these guns were assigned to special forces or guys going out on point. And there would be a Model 630, which was the same, but with no forward assist, and the Air Force adopted this as the GAU 5AA. These carbines, the first one, like I said, was 64, and then the 609, 610 appeared around 1966, with the improved 629, 630 in 1967. But these are pretty short production run guns. Already by 1970, they were effectively done with them. And while the Army and Air Force would use them a lot, the Army only had a few thousand. The Air Force seemed to have a few more, but yeah, they weren't bought in huge numbers. The regular rifle was standard, and it still had better reliability and accuracy, but for special purposes, especially with the stock collapsed in, even with the longer moderator, it's quite a bit shorter. Now, of course, this one being semi-auto and civilian, the barrel is 16 inches, so it's all extended out about an inch. But yeah, it's one of my favorite guns, both in my AR-15s and just to shoot. It's so light and handy. These are just about 6 pounds and just real slim and trim. Very keep it simple. So even though production was over in 1970, these would serve throughout the 70s and into the 80s for sure. But they were never standard as such. They were always in the XM, especially in the Army designation. But they were the first of the Colt carbines. You might say that the original first generation CAR-15s, the 10-inch, 11.5-inch barrel guns, carbines, really ended shortly after 1970. And actually, politics and gun restrictions played a significant role. These moderators were declared sound suppressors, which meant they were NFA inside the USA. But it also meant exporting, even for Colt, to other government customers was far more complicated. So really what they started doing with the Model 653 and onward, they went to a longer barrel. Now the overall length with this moderator, 14.5 inches, 15 maybe. So what they did, they went to a 14.5-inch barrel with a flash hider, which was about the same. And pretty much by accident, they discovered this was a good recipe. It wasn't really a longer gun. It wasn't any heavier. It could now, again, mount a bayonet. It could easily mount a grenade launcher. Less flash. It was just better. So by accident, by having to kind of design around new laws in the 70s, Colt came up with the 14.5-inch barrel carbine. And of course, when the switch from 1 in 12 to 1 in 7 happened, beginning in 82, this impacted the guns too. The M16 Carbines. And there's a lot of variations. Let's talk about the Air Force here, just represented by this GAU 5, or this is more of a GU 5P now. The Air Force rebuilt a lot of their original GAU 5s. They went to newer, they replaced the original metal stocks, for example, with the Fiberlite. They would upgrade some of the internals, sometimes going to newer pistol grip or newer handguards. And instead of buying all new guns to save money, they would just rebarrel them with a 1 in 7 twist barrel. Now most were 14.5, but they actually did use some 16-inch barrels for some reason. And that's what's on this one here. It's a Colt 16-inch pencil barrel. So it was a pencil profile. The Army didn't really upgrade their XM177s. They just used them until they were worn out and then gave them away or retired them. But Colt did produce guns similar to this in the 80s and early 90s. CAR-15 stock, the Fiberlite CAR-15 stock, they would somewhat get away from the 2-position extension to a 4-position in the 90s. But many of the carbines would still retain the A1 rear sight, but would have the brass deflector and A2 lower later on. Some people call these M16a1 Carbines. Others will call them a Black Hawk Down. And they can either have a pencil barrel or the heavier barrel. This is a Colt 6320 for what it's worth. But there was a big transition period, and really no standard, but special forces and the like were just kind of buying what they had. And what will become the M4, that whole program started a short time after the M16a2 was adopted. It started around 1984, 1985. Early on, these would be known as XM4s. And this was really before they had standardized. We're into the Colt 900 series, like Colt 920, 921. Again, early on, you'd have the Black Hawk Down style carbines in the early 90s. And then finally, in 1994, the XM4 would be officially adopted as the M4. And it would be the first carbine since, well, the M3, the night vision equipped from late World War II. And originally, it was not meant to be mass standard issue. It was actually just to be kind of for those same types of people that needed the original M1 Carbine. Vehicle drivers, air crews, special forces, so on and so forth. So now they have this A2 style heavy barrel, now with the cutout in it for the grenade launcher. Same flash hider. They've gone to this reversible side sling mount, which makes sense for a carbine. We still have the same 7-inch gas system that dates all the way back to the GX 5857. But we've gone away from the original single heat shield car handguards to the ovular M4 double heat shield handguards. Same lower as an A2. These would start to have a 4-position receiver extension. Now, the first several years of M4 production, we would use the Car 15 Fiberlight stock here, but by around 2000, the more familiar M4 stock would appear. Now, the original M4 had a semi-burst setting. And the very first ones, made around 95, still had a fixed carry handle with A2 sides. But very quickly, this was replaced by the removable carry handle with Picatinny rail underneath it. So yeah, 14-inch barrel, heavy out front, skinny under the handguards, extra heat shielding in the handguards, standard A2 lower, standard what we would think of today, A3 or A4 upper, standard A2 grip. And this first saw combat in 1999 in Kosovo. And again, the Army originally just planned to issue these alongside the M16A2. But then the War on Terror began. The war in Afghanistan in 2001, and then the war in Iraq in 2003. And more M4s were purchased. And what was supposed to be for special use issue ended up becoming a de facto standard issue. And that's where some problems started to appear. Some of the problems were more of the design. The 3-round burst was not sufficient for sustained firefights, and thus the M4A1 was born. Now, Initially, the difference between the M4 and M4A1 was just that. 3-round burst in the M4, full auto in the M4A1. But this would ultimately lead to several changes. When they started trying to use these, especially in full auto more, the higher cyclic rate, the higher temperatures, it had higher parts wear, parts breakage, and there were some issues at Colt, and just anyway, it was being used for things it was not designed for. So shortcomings in the design were really becoming apparent. So really between 2000 and 2005, Colt did a lot of reworking, as did the military. One of the big ones was the Model 921 HB. They took the standard weight under the Handguards barrel and beefed it up. So it's a heavy barrel throughout. They also started using H2 buffers where appropriate, and reinforcing things, small components to do with the bolt and internals and other things. And so what started off as another kind of, if not black mark, at least gray mark on the AR-15, really by the time competition was perhaps ready, for example the FN Scar, the M4A1 from Colt was pretty good. I mean, considering it was never meant to be a standard issue gun, it started to acquit itself very well with the modern production changes, updates, and upgrades to the parts. Of course, FN had been manufacturing M16s and now would start making M4s for the U.S. government as well. It wasn't just Colt, although they were still the prime contractor and possessor of the TDP. In the 21st century, like this one here, you start to see railed handguards appear, newer styles of flash hider, optics replace iron sights, sometimes new buttstocks, embed extra safeties kind of become a thing. And this becomes more piecemeal, more ad hoc basis on contracts. But this would become what people would think of when they think of the M4A1, not just the heavy barrel or the full auto, but all the other accessories. And really, over the last 10 years, the Army has purchased many conversion kits to update the M4s to M4A1. And then around 2012, just started ordering factory M4A1s with all the features like the heavy barrel. And so this is really the standard issue gun, not just the M4, but this configuration or similar to it here, or even further with even more modern rails. And in the U.S. Army, the M16 is essentially out of service, except for maybe some auxiliary things or just in inventory somewhere. Same goes for the Air Force. They always had different needs. They were always more inclined to carbines anyway. But of course, as you know, the Marine Corps were a little different. Of course, the Marines went a different way. They took this and made it into this. As I told you at the last holiday, Thanksgiving, I'm still really happy that this is kind of complete. My M16a4 MWS clone. This really is the Marines taking the initial M16 to its ultimate conclusion. Like the original, it's about 40 inches long, 20-inch barrel, although it does weigh quite a bit more than the original. 9 pounds, give or take how you have it kitted out. But all the difference between the A2 and the A4 really is, at least in the beginning in 1997 when adopted, is it has a pick rail upper like the M4 would get with removable carry handle. In the beginning it used the same plastic round handguards Of course, it uses the same buttstock, and the barrel is identical. But as time would go on, the Marines would add this RAS, the Knight's Armament, which makes it into the MWS. And then you'd start to see laser designators, bipods, ACOGs, and other sights. Sometimes they'd have the ambi selector and whatnot. Why did the Marines go this way? Well, they really liked accuracy and being a marksman. And they claim that studies they did around 2002, right about the time the Army was really going to the M4, they said that they found that the M16a4 jammed 1/3 as much as the M4. And then they did some more studies between 2004 and 2006 and found like a mean failure rate of 1 in 5,000 or something ridiculously low. And it really is a more reliable gun with the full 10-inch gas system, full rifle stock, lower cyclic rate. It is more reliable than a carbine, but it's also longer by about 6 inches, and depending on the configuration of the carbine and the gun, 1 to 2 pounds heavier. Nevertheless, that's what the Marine Corps went with. Now, they did purchase some M4s to supplement and replace pistols, but it wasn't until 2015 that they kind of authorized the M4 to start taking over from the full-length rifle. And they also did authorize some to have a collapsing buttstock. But, yeah, they were definitely the holdouts. They were kind of the big pushers for the sights on the A2 anyway. Now the two modern guns here together. Again, pretty well the same setup. Just one 14.5-inch barrel, one 20, one short gas system, one long, fixed buttstock, 4-positioning, collapsible. Otherwise, same gun. And in the last 5 years, the Marine Corps has started to transition over to the point in 2020, while they still have plenty of A4s in inventory and even some old A2s, frontline troops that are really in combat zones, especially in cities or other close quarter battle areas, they are starting to use the M4, M4A1, just like the Army. And that seems to be the direction it's all going. And these are pretty much the modern U.S. service guns. Of course, you've got the Mark 18 and Mark 12 as well, but this is a big enough video. I wanted to keep to the standards. And even though the last long part of this video has been on the AR-15 and really on Colt, this is what America has gone with for 60 years and counting. This has been America's standard rifle and then standard carbine. That's a pretty good service record. And it's interesting how that's changed things. And why is it? Well, because nothing truly revolutionarily better has come along. There's not a whole lot else out there to justify America spending the money to go to all new guns. And then, of course, again, they have done incremental upgrades and changed things a bit. But if it works, it works, and that's because the 223 cartridge, now 5.56 NATO, hasn't really been topped. Of course, we still use 7.62 NATO for heavier guns and long-range guns. And some would like to see a one-size-fits-all, like a 6.8 or even a 6.5 cartridge. But I'm of the firm belief, as are many others, that there is no such thing. But really, let's look at what some of the other nations are using. And it probably will explain why we haven't done a whole lot except add rails and more ergonomic furniture and switched from iron sights to magnified or red dot. Starting in the 70s, bullpups were kind of all the rage, at least among some. And here are two of the most modern and successful. We have the Steyr AUG A3 and the IWI Tavor X95. Really, the two first nations to go to bullpups were France with the FAMAS, which is still in service today, and Austria with the original AUG. Britain would join in the 80s with the L85, which isn't great, although the A2 is okay. And Israel would join with the original Tavor TAR-21, and now the X95, and a few other reused besides. The idea was you could have a full-length barrel, 16 or 20 inches, and a compact chassis. Good for CQB, but it also means less flexible in some ways. The trigger is never going to be great in a bullpup. And reliability can be problematic. With guns like these that are so advanced for their generation, that's not really the problem, but yeah. And most bullpups are piston driven, which is good. And accuracy is acceptable, but not stellar. The point is, while they have advantages, they're not better than the AR-15. For every advantage they have a disadvantage, and the AR-15 kind of still stands. Of course, I'd like to show you an L85 or from Moss, but we don't have semi-autos of those. And again, countries adopted these much later than America adopted the AR-15. The AUG was replacing the STG-58 FAL, and the Tavor was replacing a mix of AR-15s and the Galil, and even maybe some old FALs in Israeli service. So really they went to these because, yeah, it was time to modernize. So what else is out there? Here are two more from our allies, the HK-G36 and the Beretta Arx. Fun fact, these are both direct inspirations or based on or developments of the Armalite Ar10 we talked about earlier. The G36 was adopted in the mid-90s, and it was never intended to be a huge leap forward. It was just they needed a modern yet cost-effective gun after reuniting East and West Germany, and that's exactly what they got. It also has been not only used by other nations like Saudi Arabia and Spain, but also manufactured there, and actually has been used by a number of countries. But is it better than the AR-15? I think it's safe to say no. It is pretty light. It's pretty modular. But if you think the AR-15 has a propensity for overheating, well, yeah, meet the G36. It is very reliable. And again, it is very modular. It is very cool. But it is certainly not better. In fact, America looked at adopting a version of this known as the XM8, but didn't get much of anywhere. As for the ARX, this is the ARX 100, of course, the semi-auto. The ARX 160 is the select fire. This is a more recent advent that Beretta came up with. And I would say this does have a few aspects that the AR-15 does not. It does have a fully folding stock. Does it have dirt on it from something? I don't know what. Anyway, it has a quick change barrel. Very easy. Very modular design. Very lightweight because of the all polymer construction. It's going to bug me. I need to wipe that off. I think it was blowing up against something on the wall. Anyway. Takes AR-15 mags. Some complain about the trigger in this. It's not great, but I don't find it as terrible as others. One good thing that this has that the AR-15 does not, it is 100% ambidextrous. You're even able to swap ejection from right to left, left to right by just pressing a button with a bullet tip. Charging handle, everything is ambidextrous. The only thing that's not reversible is the way the stock folds. It only folds to the right. And this has been a good gun for Italy, and they've had some export success with it. So I would say in some ways it is better than the AR-15, looks notwithstanding, but it's not even anything close to being better or enough to justify the cost of re-equipping. It's a good gun though, and a favorite. So what else we have? Two guns that I'm contractually obligated to bring out in as many videos as I can. The Swiss SG 550 PE90 and the Czech CZ 805 Bren. I went with the Bren instead of the Bren 2 just because this is still what's mostly in the Czech military today, although the 2 is beginning to really replace it as we move into 2021. This too takes a lot of cues from the AR-18, really does, as well as the SCAR and maybe a little bit of G36, especially in the magazines. Very good gun, very reliable, but it is, as some many point out, heavy. I can't, in all honesty, say it's better than the AR-15, because the truth is modern AR-15s are basically as reliable as anything else. This is a very good, reliable gun, but it doesn't do anything that an AR can't do. That's not to say it's bad, or that I regret having it. It's a blast to shoot. Even with the Bren 2 out, we still shoot ours on the regular. And it was a very good effort from CZ after using the VZ58 for a very long time. And up in Switzerland, they adopted the 550, the STGW90, really right about the same time we adopted the M16a2. But whereas we've retired the A2, the 550 here, the full-length rifle, is still very much in service and probably will remain so for time to come. But that's what they designed it for. They knew it was going to be expensive to produce, but they also expected it to last 50 years, and that's kind of what they're getting. Now, they do have shorter versions based on the 552, 553 Commando that are coming into more special forces use now. But the rank and file Swiss soldier carries the 21-inch barrel, good old gun with iron sights. This would never really work for America. It's too big and heavy. It's too focused on durability and accuracy and the needs of the Swiss military. It is very reliable and actually quite accurate, which is interesting because it does use a Kalashnikov-style internal system, two-lug rotating bolt, and long stroke gas piston. Although the trigger components are unique, and some other stuff kind of takes cues from the AR-15 family. And speaking of the Kalashnikov, what about other guns from behind, or at least formerly behind, the Iron Curtain? Of course, we have to have some AKs in here. The top is, of course, the Polish FB Beryl, or rather the Archer, And the bottom is the Bulgarian Arsenal AR-M1 or SAM-5. These are both Kalashnikovs, but they were rechambered or made for really the 5.56 cartridge. And in different ways were attempts to modernize. The Barrel is about as far as you can take the AK and still have it be an AK. Adjustable stock, ergonomic grip, railed forearm, new pattern of scope mount on the military gun, a 4-way selector with both burst and full auto, 18-inch barrel for better accuracy. In Bulgaria, they actually went back to the milled receiver, unlike anyone else, really. They just like it. And they do all kinds, the fixed stock, underfolder, side folder, even a collapsing stock one. And today they use them both in 7.62 by 39 and 5.56, and all kinds of configurations. And both of these guns have been used by their respective countries' troops to support NATO operations as well as for export. Of course, now the Barrel is starting to be phased out in some areas by the Grot, known as the MSBS before. But in Bulgaria, the AK seems willing to stay a bit longer. Both are pretty much the pinnacle of Kalashnikov construction, and go to show you that you can have a 5.56 AK that works well. The thing is, these aren't better than an AR-15. They are reliable, and the Barrel delivers very good accuracy, but they're kind of the end of the line for the AK platform. And again, if the AR-15 still had reliability issues, I could see him making a case for going to an AK system, a long stroke, 2-lug rotating bolt. But since it's pretty well worked out, there's just no reason. And there still are a few countries that aren't using 5.56 in the world. Really, the only other intermediate cartridge in competition with 5.56 is 5.45 by 39. And it's definitely losing. Poland and Bulgaria both used it during the Comblock era, but as soon as that broke apart, they switched over to 5.56, as did most other nations that could. An example of one that hasn't been able to yet is Romania here. This is a PA-86, my SAR2. They only transitioned over to this gun and this cartridge officially in 1986, but in reality, a lot of units in Romania didn't switch over to the late 80s, early 90s. And while their special forces are starting to use more modern guns, much of their rank and file is stuck with these because they can't afford to get away from the gun or the cartridge. Ukraine is a bit in the same position. North Korea still uses it. China never used it, although they made it for export. So really the only big user, not surprisingly, is Russia. And while today they have the AK-12 and AK-15, most of their military still has the original AK-74M here, SGL-31, or even some older AKS-74s and AK-74s in some instances. They're sticking with 5.45 because that's what they're invested in, and for them there's no reason to switch to 5.56 politically, economically, or militarily. The two cartridges, depending on the loading, are very similar because one was based off the other. But yeah, 5.45 never took off on the international market like 5.56 or even 7.62 by 39. Another one worth mentioning is China. They have their 5.8 cartridge, but I'm not sure how much effort's been put into exporting that. I think that's mostly for their own consumption. And yeah, that's kind of my point. The limiting factor here and why America stuck with the AR-15 has just as much to do with the round itself as the action itself, and both are very much in the good enough category. And really, if not the absolute top of their class, are definitely in the upper half. They're better than most out there. And again, most people use 5.56 anyway. But I thought it'd be fun to do a tour of the world. Show off a few AKs to complete this video. What do you think? Well, let's get back to the couch and a few holiday thoughts. Well, guys, I wanted to give you kind of a longer effort one for the holidays. Wish you all a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. We will still be posting for the next week or so, but maybe a little less frequently. But, yeah, I think America's pursuit of a self-loading rifle is quite interesting, and often the USA was at the forefront. And the reason I included the Lee Navy, even though it's very clearly a bolt action, they did everything they could to make it as rapid a bolt action as possible. And also its 6mm cartridge really was forward thinking. Small diameter, high velocity, rimless, or at least semi-rimmed, and they did a very quick magazine system with it. And then, of course, following on with the 1903, the use of the Pedersen device was a step, although it was technically still a pistol cartridge, really. And of course, it was too late for World War II, just as the BAR and the Thompson were. But both would go on to serve in World War II. But they're still not quite there for general issue infantry, self-loading, or select fire rifle. That had to wait to the M1 Garand. And this was already quite advanced, but if it had been in the .276 Pedersen round, and if it had taken detachable box magazines, even if they were just 10 rounds, it would have been a trendsetter. But as it was, the Army's desire to keep 30-06, and for the in-block system, did hold it back a wee bit. And kind of the opposite problem with the M1 M2 Carbine, detaching mag, select fire, at least with the M2 and conversions. But it kind of like with the Pedersen, the cartridge held it back. But it really was almost. But then they got sidetracked with the M14. The concept was good, and if it had been in World War II or even Korea, but it was not the right rifle for Vietnam. Hence why it served so briefly, at least in the front lines. But what was the right rifle were, of course, the whole AR-15 family, and that's why these have continued to be updated and upgraded since 1960. And that's really where we're at today. And as I showed you, looking at a few, at least some autos of competing military designs, there's just nothing out there better. And 5.56 NATO for a PDW anti-personnel close range is about as good as it gets. And I'm really just not a big fan or believer in the one-size-fits-all round. I think you really need more of a light, small, high-velocity round for anti-personnel and CQB. And then you need a larger, harder-hitting round, heavier for light vehicles, cover, so on and so forth, and range and distance. So it took a little bit of time, but the US seems to have gotten it right, and that's why we're just kind of sticking with the M4, M4A1, and its derivatives for the time being. Well, guys, again, I wish you a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, As always, feel free to post below. And if you'd like to help support the channel going into 2021, check out the link to our Patreon page. With that, this is Misha, and also on behalf of Jay, we'll both catch you very soon next time.